Cyanide Haiku, page 1, by John S. Argetsinger. The simulator was running its third test of the week. Lambert Hampton suffered from paranoid delusions, yet had predicted nearly 25 plane crashes since 1959. He had been released from an upstate New York asylum after sawing off 2 of his toes in an ice factory. It had taken nearly a year for him to return from his psychosis. Obsessed with dreams and often drugged from his room by orderlies and thrown into a giant trough of ice water, a treatment which was regularly being practiced within the walls of the institution. After 6 months, Lambert ceased speaking, communicating with psychologists through his scribblings, manic warnings which went unheeded by all. Then in 1963, an intern was reviewing some notes left by a recently retired doctor who had been specializing in Lambert's predicament. Since his involuntary admission, she noticed a line which caught her eye. Pan Am Flight 667 will erupt into inferno. Heathrow, all will die. Earlier that month, a Boeing 707-120 had exploded on the runway in London. No survivors. She scanned further through the notes, realizing there were pages of handwritten conversation between Lambert and his doctor, Quentin Scales, a tubby Englishman who passed out drinking brandy in his oak armchair, neck pressed against the blue fabric. The yellow stain perfectly conformed to his gelatinous neck fat. After passing on the dream notes of Lambert to a supervisor, the intern returned home one night to find a bag of groceries and $300 cash stuffed into a manila envelope, the milk still sweating when she pulled it from the bag and placed it in the icebox. At the request of Kai Monroe, a recently graduated, enthusiastic man who knew the form of art and scream therapy, Lambert was released to a doctor named Tsubasa Hilano, an old drinking buddy whose family had spent time with Tsubasa in their earlier years on Earth. Most knew Tsubasa to be a quiet man who lived in a mansion along a highway in the Davis Mountains, leading up towards a recently constructed observatory, one of the first in West Texas and more widely known. Located off Highway 181, many in the area had their ramblings about what Dr. Hilano was up to, not only because he was a foreigner, yet also because nearly 15 people were supposed to have died under the care of what he called the Dream Body Project. He drove a 1966 Volvo Amazon, and it was known to special order rice from Japan at a family grocery, a particular grain which he said amplified his personal dreams. He lived alone in a pillared mansion atop a bluff, the architecture Roman in form like some living replica of a parchment in Pompeii, complete with the of an apartment in Pompeii, complete with the smell of a live-in cook and maid named Gustavo, baking sourdough. Often you could hear him playing the cello in late afternoon. Tsubasa enjoyed smoking a pipe, sometimes topped with a nugget of opium. Similarly, he had filled an entire 30 acres on his property with a poppy field. In particular, he largely strapped his vices upon poppy tea, finding ingestion of plants to far more benefit his dreams. He was largely left alone, left to clamber the American wasteland. He stood fidgeting with the soldering iron, adjusting a modulator, the clamps pressed against Lambert's sedated skull. The nurse sat fiddling with a vial, a new dose, reaching for the IV and unscrewing it, injecting the liquid. Her eyes bore down into those of Lambert through a thick set of magnifying optical lenses wrapping around her nose and ears. Lambert had been kept awake for 47 hours. For now, there was no choice. The experiment would now begin. Meeting at Oxford in the early 40s. As Dr. Helano climbed a ladder and Yvette stood staring at a glass ceiling, finally her number was called in 1950 when Dr. Helano contacted her about his new hypothesis. It had been rumored that he had been rounded up and sent to one of the camps, Hotel Hell, where he spent 3 years living in a horse stall and one in a tightly cramped, disease-ridden barracks, still happy enough just to get a chance to play baseball. Shoulders straight, eyes forward, he angled the soldering iron in his steady hand, peering through his American optical spectacles, tortoise frames reflecting a shadow upon his brow. Suddenly, Mr. Hampton began to hyperventilate, his body beginning to enter shock from the withdrawals contained within the contents of the vial. Once every 6 months, Dr. Helano would make a trip to El Paso, meeting with a man named Monroe Asabusi, who would exchange a suitcase for a suitcase outside a Greyhound station. Monroe made his living posing as a doctor himself, studying insect life in the Republic of Congo. One day, a sheriff on his day off had noticed him sticking out like a sore thumb, and although his paperwork checked out, Monroe still offered him a look inside the briefcase. Laughing gallantly, he tore it open ever so rapidly with the twist of a brass key, revealing sticks stuffed into various glass tubes sealed in cork, with notes inscribed upon each specimen. Similarly, the briefcase also contained a large array of dried flowers collected from a Congolese mountaintop. The case also included dried samples of lowland gorilla hair. Later in 1966, Yvette and Tsubasa even being provided with some of the rarest gorilla hair ever collected by so-called civilized man, the hair of Snowflake, an albino gorilla from Equatorial Guinea. The truth was, yes, this was animal hair. Yes, these flowers were real and had a purpose. Yet the purpose of Mr. Asabusi was far more sly. He supplied the psychoactive compound ibogaine in its raw state to some of the top intellectuals in the country at the time, including prominent writers, photographers, painters, and architects. Yvette quickly injected the spruce green fluid into Lambert's IV, his back coming down to rest against the bed from his careening arch. "You ready, doctor?" Subasa's whiskers flickered black and silver in the shadows of the lamp, which was illuminated across Lambert's restful frame. She adjusted the clamps about his skull, connected to 5 wires on each side, his head conformed in a sterling silver helmet connected to a long plastic tube and mask which covered his mouth, piping in nitrous oxide. Yvette reached for a cream dial, turning it to a reading of 7.67. Lambert's body beginning to slowly vibrate, his hands erupting into tremors. His brain waves blipped about one monitor while another slowly began to squeal, a treble-like tone reminiscent of AM radio space noise, congealed voices speaking in tongues backwards, the subtle howling of a distant dying star. Lambert's eyes began to twitch from side to side. A giant smile came across Subasa's face, glancing toward Yvette, and adjusting his glasses with a push of his index finger, lighting a charcoal-filtered cigarette mail-ordered from Egypt. "We're getting closer," he remarked, the smoke ruminating from his nostrils and blistering its way towards the smoke-stained ceiling, a spider slowly climbing out of its direct stream, layers of blue and gray. Suddenly the second monitor kicked on, and for the first time adorned the words, "Hello." "Gustavo, this wine tastes like turpentine. I don't know what those boys in the valley think they can pull off. This is not Argentina. Take both boxes to Eli Red Dunes. I'm sure he can find a home for the wine." Gustavo laughed. "You snoot, give them to me. The blood of Christ has always ran elegantly through my bones." Tsubasa chuckled, striking a match and taking it to his ivory pipe, the koa wood stem propped in his yellow gum line, his eyes scanning the paper engrossed in a comedic letter from an old colleague who had written to him about his two sons placing a firecracker in a piece of dog shit and waiting for the fuse to run down. After several seconds they had apparently bent down to examine it closer when it suddenly exploded, covering both their afros in a sheen of fecal matter. Dr. Halano snickered. "Yeah, take the bottles to your room, my friend. I can only use them for cooking and mulled wine." The day had been long and productive. Lambert would sleep for a full 48 hours now, maybe longer. When not sleeping, he read constantly. Dr. Halano having a special order many of his handwritten requests. They were frequently rare and always blistering near the fringes of spirituality, science fiction, and prose. Lambert had proven to be a very high-thinking mixed bag. One never quite knew his mood of the day, speaking through body language, the slouching of shoulders, movements of the eyes and brow, incessant itching, with no rash to be found. Some days he would hyperventilate, the orderlies rushing to his bedside, soothingly placing the oxygen tubes into his nostrils and a mask about his eyes, covering his ears in foam ear protectors garnished upon Navy vessels. Dr. Halano kept a tarantula and a cockroach cage in the living room, the bugs swirling about and the spider hungrily traipsing across the sand. Tsubasa dropped 4 crickets into her cage, her furry legs chasing after her prey. Gustavo had prepared verde enchiladas for Tsubasa, his favorite. He lay awry on the couch in the living room, drunk on wine, blasting Debussy on vinyl. Suddenly the telephone began to ring. He suddenly reached for the receiver. It was Yvette. She informed him the quantum data had been completed and was hot and ready. Tsubasa saving the excitement for the morning and lighting an Egyptian cigarette. Although he was itching to discover the results, He knew he must rest his own mind for his own sanity. Long enough time had been spent with Lambert to know better. He reached for the poppy pod, smashing in between his index and thumb, placing the pod and seeds into the grinder. He would make tea and sit with the radio, slowly fading into his own dreamscapes, awaiting all that was the next world, a broadcast behind his eyelids. This was the eternal journey. Although junk sick by 6 p.m. on a nightly basis, it allowed him to see into the next world, the next dimension. It was a quiet, hand-clamped addiction hidden from all of his colleagues. Not even Gustavo wanted to know why there were 10,000 poppies growing in this guy's backyard. This trip was eternal, clamped down, hard line with reality. It was no vacation on a cruise ship. No, this was more of a war within. Leavitt law was used in measuring the distance of stars from Earth. Henrietta Swan Leavitt was an astronomer working as a human computer at Harvard College. Using photographic plates, she was tasked with measuring star brightness. Known as a relentless worker, she soon discovered the relation between luminosity and the period of Cepheid variables. She received nearly no recognition for her work. She unlocked the strain in the universe, which cataloged the measurement of star distance from Earth by processing data to reveal that stars which measured and were blipping through telescopes at a slow beating rate were farther away, while faster blipping stars were closer to the spectrum of Earth's various horizon points. This data was cataloged, quantified, and put into living study use by astronomers worldwide. Her work and that of so many of her other female colleagues went into the hidden pages of American history books to keep young girls striving to be on the cover of Cosmopolitan rather than their upfront editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine or an editorial in the Atlantic. Leavitt law had become absolutely crucial in Dr. Holano's study. It tied into nonlinear quantum data, largely which had been later proven to be the truest form of math aligned to the patterns of the black hole at the center of the universe. Indigenous peoples had long been tuned into the socket, the satellite which guided them, not to that of the Western chain of thought. Dr. Holano lay in his marble bathtub with a bottle of wine from 1928 perched about the edge of the tub next to his chalice. He lay in the piping waters, his mind brisk and at one with all that was the luster of life. Guided by dreams and nightmares, he found no difference between the two. The Dream Body project was truly right where he needed it. The portal now unlocked, the equipment running in tip-top shape. This had been the most exciting year of his career. Yet he was still regarded as a demon in exile by all of his colleagues, a madman hell-bent upon impossible tasks. Dr. Holano seemed to only find a purpose in rising from bed every day to await a challenge, a meltdown, a car crash, a broken hand, sleepwalking through the gray streets of dawn while ignoring all red hands instructing him to stop. He was a man fueled by his own demons as much as his own deep empathy, a man incarcerated by the United States of America who held no ill will for the state itself, but instead the individuals who had lowered themselves to stand guard over working Japanese Americans, business owners, artists, scientists, inventors, professors, your neighbors. America watched all of this. Tsubasa raised his head from the depths of the water and reached for his glass, taking a long swill. He was well aware that if you were not careful, the hate of the world would devour your soul like a demon. Earth was no place where grace was often given, with the becoming of all that were the true horrors of mankind. Earth, to Dr. Helano, was a natural satellite similar to the moon. Given that Jupiter had 67 moons, he had concluded that the Earth was nothing but a young woman cast spinning about in the heavens. She was not a planet which he wished to remain in, however. The Dream Body Project was his ticket off the planet. Direct contact had been established. This much was certain. What he could neither confirm nor deny. This was a battle of the human condition, and the world would continue to laugh at him until he had completed his experiments. Yet the Achilles heel was Lambert. He wished to remain, for now. Yet what if he suddenly decided to walk away from the project? Where would that leave him? He closed his eyes once more, the wine easing its way down his gullet. And that concludes the reading of Cyanide Haiku, pages 2 through 4.